Thanks so much for joining me on the Slice of Healthcare podcast. I'm your host, Jared Taylor. Joining me today on the podcast is Matt Michela, the president and CEO at Life Image. Matt, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Jared. Thanks. Appreciate you spending a few minutes with me today.
Absolutely. I'm excited for us to chat, and I think we should dive right into it. I'd love if you could tell the audience a little bit about your background, and then we'll dive into more about Life Image and some of the key questions we wanted to go through today.
Sure. So I'm an old healthcare guy. I've been, unfortunately, I have to say, almost 40 years now in healthcare, a whole variety of roles, right? So I've worked in the big payer world for insurance companies. I've worked in the pharmaceutical and life science space. I've worked in the technology space. I've worked internationally. I've started, built and sold 4 of my own healthcare companies. And for the last handful of years, I've been working as the president and CEO of Life Image, which is the world's largest, right, medical image exchange company, right? If I really use the language, right, of healthcare, we're a company focused on interoperability and provisioning medical evidence, right, for where it's needed, right? In non-technical terms, right, basically our job is to get medical data, right, imaging and other types of medical information from where it's born or where it lives, right, in a hospital, in a database somewhere, into the hands of someone that can use it for diagnosis, for treatment, for research, right? For all the purposes ultimately you would need, right? And Life Image is about 15 years old as a company and has, and it's a software solution that's utilized by 19 of the top 20 medical institutions in the United States today, and about 10,000 or so medical facilities in the US today. So it's a very, very large network focused on, connecting data to people.
Wow, you're really all over the place. It's a couple of the things that we really wanted to go through today. Thank you for that intro too, and telling us a little bit more about Life Image for those who haven't heard of the company. A few of the big focus areas that we wanted to go through today was one of the big questions being how to improve data sharing practices across a healthcare organization. So I want to ask you that, and then we'll dive more into like ONC, federal, like information blocking rules and some of those other standards as we go through this. But I want to start off with that question, hear your response, and we'll go into these other questions here today as well.
Sure. So in general, when we think about healthcare data, right, just for broad context, right, healthcare data is a really, really valuable asset if you're a healthcare organization, whether you're conducting research or you're working with patients, right? It describes, right, the evidence of what is going on with your disease and your progression. And so historically, right, the focus of organizations that, create technology, right, to measure healthcare things, whether it's somebody measuring, a component in your blood, or it's somebody that's taking a picture of your lungs, et cetera, that, science of how do I get that diagnostic data out as an example, or even a physician's notes of this is what I think is going on with you and what your background is, right, is data where the organizations that collect that are way more concerned, right, about what they can do with the data than they are about making that data available to other people. Right. And so the science and the technology, if we want to be kind to the industry, is something that has always taken precedent over making data available to somebody that's not you, right, here across the board. And then coupling that, right, we have this legacy of these patient privacy laws and predominantly, HIPAA, which we're instructed to help protect privacy of healthcare data, but ultimately, right, transformed into a place that created then justified barriers for sharing data more broadly, right, which frankly raises the cost of the healthcare system to everybody and creates medical errors and problems for patients, but was used really to build an infrastructure that created these walls and barriers. So we had a coupling of technology challenges, companies who invent fantastic science, but are not concerned about making sure data is available here, and then federal legislation says you better be really, really careful. And so that evolved over decades to a place, right, where data sits in all of these disparate silos and is protected and controlled and owned. And a patient doesn't actually technically even own their own data. And I know for consumers and patients that can blow your mind, right? Of I go to the doctor, they take a test, they take a picture or an image for me, and it's not my data. Well, no, by law, it's actually not. It's their data. and they can sell it, they can transform it, they can do research with it, they can do all sorts of things as long as they don't violate federal law. And you can get it if you request it, and it can be shared with you, but it's actually not yours to own, right? And so what's going on here is the federal government, right, stepped in, right, a handful of years ago to pass legislation, which was bipartisan legislation, that basically said, no, we're going to turn this thing on its head, right? Healthcare in the future, right, needs to be far different than in the past. And we're never going to solve a cost problem or a quality problem. We're not going to be able to advance research and clinical, innovation in the way that we need to, because it's incredibly slow. If it takes you 14 years to develop a drug, right, frankly, 75% of that may just be the data piece. I can't get patients. I can't find out what happened with the patients. I can't get the records, right? It's an amazingly cost extensive kind of burden and process that we all bear by higher healthcare costs. And the federal government said, no, we're not going to do that. What we are going to do, right, is we're going to force data sharing. And we know that there's a technology problem. So we're going to make all healthcare technology vendors use a single healthcare standard, right? If you're an IT person, it's called FHIR. And basically it's a way for different software programs to connect to each other and exchange data here. And so they said, everybody's going to have to comply with that standard. But they did something that was actually fundamentally more important here. And what they did was they said, the patient really is the center of the universe. And as providers, right, we understand your key role in providing healthcare and your experience and your training and your judgment that's so fundamental, right, to everything. But when it comes to data, the data has to be provided back to the patient. And you need to do it quickly and easily, without tons of paperwork, without making them jump through hoops, without excessive cost, without making them spend a lot of money on new technology as a consumer. And you have to give them, data that allows them to understand what's going on, seek care from other providers, make wise choices about what healthcare costs to them and what it works, moves forward. And so we've now embarked upon this new technology data medical infrastructure, right? Again, promulgated by these, federal laws and these new rules, right, that the ONC has put together that says the patient's the center of the world. And over time, this rising consumerism, right? Every other industry but healthcare, consumers have their data, can make their choices. It's theirs. They can use it. They can own it. They can share it. They can pair shop, right? They combine it with other things. You can understand it, right? Not in healthcare. And so we're going to change that. We're going to make that, move forward. And so so how we improve these data sharing things, right, is again, understanding conceptually that the patient is the center of the universe. Needs to be, never has been in healthcare, regardless of what we had, we say to each other, but it has to be, put the patient in the center. Their data is liquid and it's theirs. We have to give them to them easily, right? And if we can make data, break down those barriers and make it, right, more accessible to everybody with the proper consents, right, in place, then we will see, right, faster innovation, lower cost innovation, lower healthcare, and a bigger role consumers can play, which ultimately make healthcare more competitive, in the United States, which will help us all here across the board. So I know I went on a little bit there, Jared.
No, that was perfect. And whenever someone's in a groove, I don't stop them because it's gold, right? That's something great that we can clip and we can put together some additional pieces of content off of that. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. I do have another question in terms of these, some of the rules that you're talking about. And it seems like those were put in place for both the organization, but also the patient's best interest in mind, right? We want to make sure that I feel like that's still what you've said about, like that's their data. I feel like to the general public that there's still a misconception of that, right? Like you always hear like, why can't I constantly have my information whenever I want it right now? And the way that you explained it is probably one of the best explanations I've heard in terms of like whose information it is and why is it their information and what can they do with it. And I think a lot of people think that they can kind of sell and do whatever they want with your data. And there are certain rules, right, that you're allowed to interact with. I want to go into the people that break these rules a little bit. Why and how have organizations violated some of these rules that you mentioned?
Right. So we talk about the rules, right? They were basically put in place after several years of evaluation and public comments and all the things that governments normally do. And our government, I should suggest, normally does, right, to try to get the best outcome possible. right, in April of 2020, right? So and what basically, again, those rules said was, number one, the patient's at the center and they have real rights and you have to respect those and you have to not create, barriers or additional costs for them. Number two, you have to use a standard technology interface so that, my Android can connect to my iPhone and get iMessages, right? That my EHR, right, can connect to an iPhone, right, down the road if they need to. That an application, right, for a brand new innovative healthcare IT company that wants to focus on behavioral health or mental health, right, can connect to you standardly. So that they establish a technology standard, which is really, really important, because technology has been used as the excuse, right, for not sharing data historically here, across the board. Then what the rules basically said was, and if you don't if you don't do these things, there will be penalties, and these penalties will be financial and they will be substantial. Now, there's still some hemming and hawing about what those penalties will be, how are they applied, what really is fair and isn't fair, what's kind of a best effort in order to try to get there when you have some organizational barriers, or if you don't have the money to comply, and what does that mean? So some of that still has to be sorted out, and much of this was delayed because of the pandemic, right? The rules, the institution of the rules and the institution of the penalty compliance, right, piece of this were delayed, but they're coming on now, and it's going to be right in front of folks. And we can anticipate that the penalties for data blocking, for information blocking, not giving it to patients or providers when they need it, is going to be quite substantial, right? Especially for large providers that might be seeing tens of thousands of patients or hundreds of thousands of patients over a year, right? A penalty of a few $1,000s a patient, right, all of a sudden starts to get huge. So folks are going to start paying attention to this, right? I think pretty soon. Not that they're not paying attention now. We do have folks that aren't complying, right, here across the board. Mostly the reason now that folks aren't complying, if you had asked me, 30 years ago when I was writing about interoperability, or even 10 years ago, I'd say a lot of the non-compliance is because providers don't want to do it. It's an extra task, it's administrative task, it has cost. And culturally, and I'll say historically, right, the systems were set up and providers were trained to recognize that they're the ones that went to school, they're the ones that understand the science, they're the ones that understand the data. Their judgment around the medical issues is frankly superior, right, to the medical judgment of a patient that hasn't been trained. So they don't need to see the data. I can see it, interpret it, give it to them, share it with them. I'll tell them what they should do, make them recommendations. If they don't like it, go to another doc who also isn't going to share their data with them in detail, but is going to provide that judgment, right? And so we've trained, right, folks historically to do that. And so there was no effort, right, really to put forward to make this happen. And that's kind of why healthcare sits as the last bastion of anti-consumerism, right, here, that the federal government is going to try to help us here. The other last kind of component was they decided what data needed to be shared, because that's a very complicated question. In healthcare, there are millions of types of data that's out there. Even in like imaging, right, which is a particular specialty, right, of ours at Life Image, right, there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different types of imaging and imaging types. Even though we enforced 20 years ago a relatively consistent standard for imaging, every organization, every manufacturer does something slightly different to tweak it to make it, theirs for useful purposes. And so when we think about that and think about every experience that a patient can have in the healthcare system, there's millions of types of data. So the federal government had to come in and say, what's the basic set? And they created a data set and said, these are the data elements, right, as you would need to do in the technology world. And the things like, a patient's, obviously it's their date of birth and their gender. It's what's their allergy history, what's the medications they've taken and the medication history. It's what diagnoses they have they been treated, physician notes about that sit in the system, not the actual kind of, the results of pathology that's been done, or genetic testing, or radiology. And so it's a pretty comprehensive set, although if you look at it from healthcare, right, it's 1% of everything that exists, but it's that 1% that affects 99% of healthcare delivery. So it's pretty important, and that data becomes available over time. That data set's going to increase over time, right? So as an example, this very first set of data doesn't include the actual pathology images, doesn't include the actual radiology images itself. Those are really challenging types of data to handle, and the industry isn't quite ready. I say that knowing that we've been doing that for 15 years and for tens of thousands of facilities here across the globe. But as an industry, we're not quite ready yet to do that, but it will come and evolve. And the idea here is that data will become more liquid, and kind of more comprehensive here. But to your core question of why people aren't, in complying, well, number one is there haven't been penalties yet because they've been delayed because of the pandemic. And once those start, it will increase awareness. We have, unfortunately, a significant portion of folks who work in healthcare organizations that haven't been trained or educated on this yet. And it takes a long time for adoption in healthcare, right? We're used to years and years and years. I mean, my God, we're still using fax machines. It's like, it's shocking, right? We still have, even though Life Image is the largest network's been helping digitally transfer medical imaging, right, for a decade and a half, about a third, right, of all providers that deal with imaging still only do it, right, with physical CDs, right, which is costly and delays, and it's a mess, right? But it takes a long time in healthcare. So when we talk about promulgating fairly complicated new technology rules and practices and changing behavior, it takes a while. And we found, right, in some work that we had done, right, that there's still a significant portion of people in healthcare who don't understand still the concept of information blocking. They don't figure out that the federal government has now said patients actually have a real role here, and you have to work with them and satisfy their needs, right? Or there will be consequences. So we got an educational component. We got a very serious cultural component, right? Because again, we've not trained people in the medical profession, right? And we haven't set up in the bureaucracy of healthcare organizations a culture where consumers are the center and they have actual authority, right? I go in to see the physician, and it's 2021. I go in for an appointment. I sit in the waiting room. I wait 30 minutes for the physician to free up because something happened to his or her kind of day here. And their job, right, is to make sure that inside the practice that the physician is most effective, get the most visits in a day, to apply their knowledge in the most efficient way possible. And patients are widgets in that, right? And the 30 minutes I had to wait in the office is slightly inconvenient, but it's not like it was a physician sitting around 30 minutes waiting as a precious resource. So they don't see consumers yet as an industry-wide, as a precious resource. Again, don't have the information, can't shop. There's a lot of barriers for that. This is intending to change that. So culturally, organizations have to educate themselves about what this really means, that a patient is not just a nameless illness, a diagnosis here, but it's somebody that can pick up and go somewhere else because now they have the data and access to do it. They can get care remotely if they have to. And if you don't cooperate with them, they can call the ONC and get you fined, right? So it's a cultural issue. The technology itself will always drag, but technology is pretty resilient now. We've had enough time for most of the major healthcare IT vendors to comply, right? The federal government basically financed the entire industry's conversion to electronic health records with billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment into the private sector over pretty much 2 decades. So every institution has an EHR that fundamentally can transfer this data inside their own institution. Is it expensive? Sure. Is it burdensome? Sure. Do they have to have big IT staffs to do it? Sure. But it's embedded now. So now it's a question of getting folks to comply with a single standard, which again has been regulated now, and then starting to educate themselves that they have to do it. Because most cases of noncompliance is a lack of awareness, right? A lack of understanding, and then a lack of appreciation that they actually have to do it. And I would link those 3 things before I get to the technology. The technology has always historically been used as the scapegoat of, well, my software won't do it. So drive 45 minutes in, fill out these 19 consent forms, go to 4 places inside my hospital. I know you want your record, but I'll give you these 2 pieces of paper, not the 500 I have in my system. And here's a CD, which, by the way, is corrupt. So I'll see you again in 10 days when you figure that out, right? Those era will hopefully be in the rearview mirror, down the road. It will take a while to adopt, but we're moving in the right direction finally.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how things continue to progress. It'll be interesting to hear more information too regarding what type of fines companies will be looking at if they aren't complying. And then it's always interesting to see like what the biggest fine ends up being, because someone eventually is going to have some massive fine. It's no matter how many rules are in place, right? Something always gets broken at some point by some party, and that's kind of the person they make or organization they make an example out of, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and again, I don't think that the regulators are out to punish providers operating in goodwill. But we got a pretty big pretty big system here in the United States, and there are always a portion of folks that don't provide, do the best effort, right, with goodwill. And it will take probably a few big fines that will be there, that will probably be generated by complaints from consumers, right? Quite honestly. And when consumers start to understand and get educated, they can call an 800 number and they can send an email, and that the government will follow up, right? I think that will be an important piece. In the industry, we always talk about the carrots and the sticks, right, here. And, people hate to talk about the stick with compliance, and it does it work, and it creates barriers and resistance. And that's true, right? But when you're dealing with a bureaucracy that manages risk, right? So much of healthcare is set up to manage risk, litigation risk, right, from attorneys, right? It's also set up to manage regulatory risk. Nobody wants to be shut down. Nobody wants to stop Medicare paying them, right? Nobody wants to, get millions of dollars of fines. I suspect those things will be coming here. And, if it follows the same evolution that we've had with healthcare regulation in the past, right? There'll be a few warning shots. There'll be a few really big cases, and then somebody will respond and say, wow, right? We really better get our act together, because the consequence of paying millions of dollars when I don't have it is far less than putting in place what we need to do. We'll see. Healthcare is hard. We, as an industry, we resist lots of change all the time. In an industry that's built on innovation, the greatest science of the world, and the greatest healthcare delivery, possibilities in the planet, right? Boy, as an industry, we don't like to change.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Well, Matt, I want to thank you again for being a guest on the podcast. Hopefully we can have you on again sometime. We can go into some other topics, but I appreciate you coming on the podcast today and going through a few of the questions we laid out. Wish you and Life Image all the best, and can't wait to connect again soon.
Thanks, Jared. Really appreciate the time. It was fun. Thank you.